If you have ever believed that the men and women who command America's military exist above politics, that they operate in a sealed chamber of duty, law, and professional honor, untouched by the pressures of whichever administration happens to occupy the White House, then what is happening right now inside the United States Armed Forces will shake that belief to its foundation. Stay with us, because this story goes far deeper than any headline has yet captured, and the implications of what senior commanders are doing and what they are refusing to do could shape the future of American democracy itself. We are living through the most consequential rupture between a sitting American president and his own military leadership in modern history. It is not playing out in dramatic press conferences or loud resignations. It is playing out in silence, in stone faces, in private warnings delivered behind closed doors and then denied publicly, in admirals who quietly retire rather than carry out orders they consider illegal, in hundreds of troops filing formal complaints because their commanders are telling them that bombing Iran is part of God's divine plan. This is not a story the administration wants you to hear, but it is happening, and it is happening right now. Let us take you back to September 30th, 2025. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth abruptly summoned hundreds of the most senior military officers in the United States, generals, admirals, the very apex of the chain of command, to Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia. The purpose was to hear directly from Hegseth and from President Trump. It was framed as a demonstration of command authority, a moment of alignment between the civilian leadership and the uniformed military. What actually happened in that room told a completely different story. Before Trump and Hegseth arrived to speak, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane quietly gave the assembled generals and admirals a piece of private advice. He told them not to cheer, not to react, to remain as stoic and expressionless as they would during a president's annual State of the Union address, in keeping with the long-standing norms of a nonpartisan military. When Trump walked into that room, he walked into silence. He looked out at hundreds of four-star faces that gave him nothing. No applause, no energy, no validation. He was visibly unsettled. "I've never walked into a room so silent before," he said from the podium. "If you want to applaud, you applaud." The generals did not applaud. The Pentagon spokesman later disputed that Kane had instructed this behavior. Multiple military officials confirmed to CNN that he had. That moment, that silent room, was the opening act of something that has now grown into a full-blown institutional crisis, and it is unfolding against the backdrop of the most significant American military operation since the Iraq War. On February 28, 2026, President Trump announced via an 8-minute video posted to his Truth Social account at 2 in the morning that the United States and Israel had launched a massive coordinated strike campaign against Iran. There was no address to Congress, no primetime national address, no formal declaration of war. The Gang of Eight, the 8 most senior congressional leaders, received a brief classified notification shortly before bombs began to fall. The operation was codenamed Operation Epic Fury by the American side and Operation Roaring Lion by Israel. Its stated objectives were sweeping and historically audacious: destroy Iran's ballistic missile infrastructure and nuclear program, eliminate the leadership of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, annihilate Iran's naval capabilities, and achieve regime change from within. By the end of the first day, the United States had conducted 900 strikes against Iranian targets. Israel's Air Force simultaneously hit nearly 500 targets with 200 jets. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was dead. Iran's military command structure was, by the Pentagon's own admission, in chaos, and America's top general had not wanted any of it. Before the bombs fell, before Trump made his midnight announcement, General Dan Kane had been doing something extraordinary for a man who serves at the pleasure of the president. He had been telling Trump the truth. According to 2 sources with direct knowledge of the internal discussions, as reported by Axios and confirmed by CNN, Kane had warned the president and senior administration officials in detailed private meetings that a military campaign against Iran carried risks unlike anything the administration had previously undertaken. He pointed specifically to a critical shortage of key munitions that would be needed to sustain a prolonged campaign. He raised the alarming absence of regional allied support. Several key partners had made clear they would not provide base access or logistical assistance for offensive operations. He warned that unlike the Venezuela operation, which succeeded in a matter of days with the capture of Nicolas Maduro, Iran was a fundamentally different kind of adversary. A nation of 90 million people with deep institutional resilience, proxy networks across 6 countries, and the demonstrated willingness to absorb tremendous punishment and retaliate across a wide geographic theater. One source who was present in those meetings described Cain to Axios as a reluctant warrior on Iran. Another said Cain was clear-eyed and realistic about what success would require and what could follow once the shooting started. The Washington Post separately confirmed that the CENTCOM commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, the 4-star officer who would actually oversee the operational execution of any Iran campaign, had not been invited to relevant planning meetings and had not spoken directly with Trump since January. The man responsible for commanding the war was excluded from the conversations leading up to it. Trump's response to these reports was swift and revealing. He took to Truth Social to denounce what he called fake news media stories about Cain's caution. He insisted his general was fully behind the operation and only knew one thing: how to win. The contrast between what was being reported by multiple independent sources with direct knowledge and what Trump was saying publicly crystallized something important. The president needed his general's public silence, even as he refused to fully accept his general's private counsel. Cain executed his orders. The bombs fell. But the fact that America's top military officer had privately expressed serious reservations about this war before it was launched is not a footnote. It is one of the most significant pieces of information about the current conflict that the American public deserves to understand. And it does not stand alone. Admiral Alvin Halsey commanded the United States Southern Command, which oversees all American military operations in Latin America and the Caribbean. He was 1 year into that command when Defense Secretary Hegseth ousted him. What had happened? Halsey had reportedly developed deep reservations about orders he believed crossed a legal line. Specifically, directives related to the use of military force against boats suspected of drug trafficking. Rather than continue in his role and execute orders he considered illegal, Halsey retired early. He did not hold a press conference. He did not leak to reporters. He simply left. But what happened next is where this story becomes extraordinary. General Dan Cain presided over Halsey's retirement ceremony, and in front of witnesses, Cain showered the departing admiral with praise that was impossible to interpret as anything other than a pointed rebuke of Hegseth's decision. "It's never been about you," Cain told Halsey. "It's been about people. It's been about others. You've never said I in all the conversations we've had. You've always said we." Multiple officials who were present perceived the moment as Cain's deliberate, quiet act of protest. He could not stop the firing, but he could honor the man who was fired for refusing to carry out what he believed were illegal orders. In the culture of the American military, where institutional loyalty runs bone deep and public criticism of civilian superiors is essentially forbidden, that ceremony was as close to a public statement of dissent as Cain could make without ending his own career. Understanding why active duty commanders are so constrained in expressing dissent requires understanding what this administration has done to those who fell out of favor. The purge of senior military leadership under Trump's second term has been sweeping and unprecedented. Trump fired General C.Q. Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, breaking with decades of precedent and removing one of the most respected officers in the American military. Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the Navy's first female chief of naval operations, was fired. Admiral Linda Fagan, the first female commandant of the Coast Guard, was removed. Lieutenant General Jennifer Short, Lieutenant General Talita Crosland, Vice Admiral Shoshana Chatfield, officers with decades of combat command experience between them, were pushed out. The total number of senior officers dismissed by this administration has exceeded 10, with dozens more subject to forced retirements and delayed promotions. Senator Tammy Duckworth, herself a combat veteran and double amputee from the Iraq War, called it a deliberate purge of expertise from the American military that is eroding the very institution the public relies on to keep them safe. A retired four-star officer who spoke to NPR on condition of anonymity said the picture among his still-serving colleagues was one of fear. His friends still on active duty, he said, are afraid to say anything, afraid to stand up, afraid to be fired. When you fire enough people, the ones who remain learn to be silent. The consequences of that silence are now manifesting in ways that go beyond strategic disagreement. Since Operation Epic Fury began on February 28th, a military watchdog organization called the Military Religious Freedom Foundation has been flooded with complaints from service members stationed across the Middle East. By Tuesday, March 3rd, the foundation had received and logged more than 200 formal complaints, coming from members across all branches of the armed forces stationed at well over 50 military installations. The complaints tell a consistent and deeply disturbing story. High-ranking officers are standing up in front of their troops and telling them that the war against Iran is not merely a military or political operation. It is, they are being told, part of God's divine plan. One non-commissioned officer filed a complaint on behalf of himself and 15 fellow unit members, including 11 Christians, 1 Muslim, and 1 Jewish service member. He described a combat readiness briefing in which his commanding officer opened by urging troops not to be afraid of what was happening in Iran. The commander then told his soldiers that the war was all part of God's divine plan, invoking multiple passages from the book of Revelation about Armageddon and the imminent return of Jesus Christ. He told them, according to the complaint, that President Trump had been anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran to cause Armageddon and mark his return to earth. The officer filing the complaint wrote that such statements destroy morale and unit cohesion and represent a fundamental violation of the constitutional oaths all service members swear. The Pentagon, when asked to respond to these complaints, did not address them directly. A spokesperson referred reporters to Defense Secretary Hegseth's press conference remarks about the objectives of Operation Epic Fury. Mikey Weinstein, the founder of the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, put the danger plainly. What is being created, he said, is a propaganda bonanza for Al-Qaeda, for ISIS, for Boko Haram. It is inflaming the passions of everyone in Iran, and it is religious extremism masquerading as military leadership. Meanwhile, the constitutional machinery designed to restrain presidential war-making has been tested and found wanting. After the strikes on Iran began, Democrats in Congress, joined by a handful of Republicans, moved quickly to force a vote on a war powers resolution that would require congressional authorization for further non-defensive military action. The effort was backed by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, himself a former military lawyer, who said bluntly that the Constitution does not allow the country to be at war without a vote of Congress, and that the lives of American troops are at stake. Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, a retired Navy pilot with combat experience, said Trump had no plan to avoid escalation into a wider conflict that would put more service members in harm's way. Republican Senator Rand Paul, the libertarian conscience of his party on matters of executive war power, joined the effort. The Senate voted on March 4th. The resolution failed 47 to 53, falling short of the threshold needed to advance. Only Paul crossed party lines from the Republican side. Senator John Fetterman, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, voted with the Republican majority in support of the war. Most Republicans argued that the president was operating within his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. The House was scheduled to take up a similar resolution the following day, with House Speaker Mike Johnson expressing confidence it would also fail. The war would continue on Trump's terms without formal congressional authorization, at least for now. What does all of this add up to? It adds up to something that military historians and constitutional scholars are already describing as a test case for the limits of civilian control of the military in an era of deep institutional stress. The Trump administration has systematically removed senior officers who showed any signs of independence or skepticism. It has created a culture of fear in which active duty commanders are reluctant to raise professional objections, even in private. The one man who sits at the top of the uniformed military, General Dan Kane, did raise those objections privately. He was overruled. He then executed his orders and stood at a podium to brief the press alongside Hegseth, describing the pace of operations and the acceleration of strikes. He is still the chairman. He is still serving. But the picture that emerges from every credible account of his conduct is of a man performing one of the most difficult balancing acts in the history of American military service, trying to preserve the institutional integrity of the armed forces, trying to give honest counsel to a president who does not always want to hear it, trying to honor officers who are pushed out for doing their jobs, all while operating inside a system where the price of speaking too clearly is the end of your career and the unraveling of the very institutional influence you are trying to preserve. The soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines who are flying those missions over Iran, intercepting Iranian drones and ballistic missiles, watching their CENTCOM colleagues get hit at bases in Kuwait and Bahrain and Jordan and Iraq, they are serving with courage and professionalism, regardless of the political circumstances that put them in harm's way. 3 American service members have already been killed in this operation. Dozens more have been wounded. Iran has launched more than 2,000 drones and 500 ballistic missiles in retaliation. The Strait of Hormuz has effectively been closed to tanker traffic, threatening 20% of the world's daily oil supply. The conflict has already spread to Lebanon, Cyprus, Syria, and the waters off Sri Lanka. The risks that General Kane warned about in those private pre-war meetings are materializing in real time. Here is the question that history will ask about this moment, when the senior commanders of the most powerful military on earth privately expressed reservations about a war, warned of missing munitions and absent allies and the risk of entanglement, and those warnings were overruled and then publicly denied by the president who overruled them. What was the duty of those commanders? The answer is complicated by everything that makes the American constitutional tradition both admirable and fragile. Civilian control of the military is not just a bureaucratic rule. It is the bedrock principle that separates a democratic republic from a military junta. The generals and admirals serve the elected civilian leadership, even when they disagree with it. They give their honest counsel, and then, if they are overruled, they execute lawful orders or they resign. What they cannot do, what distinguishes the American military from the armies of history's cautionary tales, is substitute their judgment for the judgment of the elected government. General Kane appears to understand this, but understanding a principle and living comfortably inside its consequences are two very different things. The silence in that room at Quantico last September was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of men and women who understood something that the man at the podium did not. They were watching the line between professional counsel and political theater being crossed, and they were choosing, together, in the most visible way available to them within the constraints of their oath, to refuse to be part of the performance. That silence cost them nothing that day. What it meant for the country, as Operation Epic Fury enters its 6th day and the bombs continue to fall on Tehran, is something that none of us yet fully knows.